cultural approaches to organizations is a nice way of extending the interpretive framework or the interpretive paradigm into an organizational setting. But one of the ways that we want to make sense of this is to ask questions about how we understand culture more broadly from this interpretive perspective. So this presentation is going to do some work of talking about sort of the overall anthropological approach that the interpretive paradigm takes to understanding culture, and then we'll take that and look at that organizational life specifically and the ways that organizations can be understood from a cultural perspective. Now, one of the people that is inherent, or, just as a primary researcher that talks about, how not organizational life, but how cultural life can be understood from this interpretive perspective is Clifford Geertz. Now, Clifford Geertz was a researcher, an anthropologist that studied the Balinese culture. Was one of the things that he studied. He studied a lot of things, but Balinese culture. And when he studied Balinese culture, he and his wife were there this is back in the 60s, 50s, where he was studying the culture there from an anthropological or ethnographic perspective. And he was there and he was asking questions about Balinese culture and kind of going around and meeting townsfolk and just kind of talking through what it is about Balinese culture. As he's there, he accidentally stumbles across a Balinese cockfighting ring. And in his research while he was there, he was kind of interested about this because Balinese cockfighting, much like the cockfighting in the United States or many other countries, is illegal. And so he stumbles across this cockfighting ring and he's very curious about it. So he stays there and he's observing and he's saying, there's a lot of interesting practices here. Well, of course, many things happen during a Balinese cockfight, and he's curious about those things. As he's watching, the police happen to show up and start to break up the cockfighting ring, and because of it's illegal. And so, what do you do if you're a researcher from overseas that's studying an illegal behavior and you accidentally stumble into it? Well, you run from the cops, and that's what he did. And so Clifford Geertz is running from the cops in the middle of Bali, and he's terrified. He's want to get arrested, and so he's running. And the other people that are there also scatter. They're all running from the cops, and one wants to be arrested. And so he's running with these other people, and they duck into like an alley or back, side house thing, and they immediately they encourage him, come here. And he goes in with these other people. And they go to a house. They quickly set up a table, and they put together like tea and like coffee and stuff like that, as if they've been hanging out the whole time. Cops come in, they say, "Hey, what's going on? Do you know anything about a cockfighting ring that was up there?" And they're like, No, we've just been hanging out, talking about Balinese culture. This esteemed researcher from overseas is here talking with us, and we're explaining things of Balinese culture. I don't know what you're talking about with the Balinese cockfight. Well, because he ran from the cops and he had this little moment where he lied to them later on about how he hadn't observed this whole thing, he gained access to this culture and this sort of underground subculture of Balinese cockfighting. And he found out there's some really interesting things about cockfighting. That in the Balinese culture and language, number one, that the double entendre of the word cock, and forgive me here as I go through this, but the double entendre of the word cock is also in Balinese language as much as it is in English. And so all of the sort of elements of cockfighting that were going on had this sort of masculine overtones to it. And some of it was pretty explicit. And so he talks about things about how there was a presentation of cocks, and then the men would come into the ring and present the cocks that were about to fight, and there'd be all kinds of, they would, present them to each other and pet them and show them off, and then they would fight each other, and then at the same time, women were not allowed to watch. They were allowed to watch, but they were not allowed to participate in any of it. At best, they were allowed to sell food or other trinkets on the sides. He discovered that there was all kinds of rules to cockfighting, that you couldn't bet against your family's cock because that would be a violation of some of the rules, of the cultural rules that were there. And so if your cousin or brother or something like that was fighting, then you couldn't bet against them because that would be a violation of some of the overall cultural understanding. Now, the story of Clifford Geertz and the work that he did is fascinating insofar as it really gets at this in-depth, thorough examination of the gendered elements of masculinity inside of the sports event of cockfighting in a particular culture. But he engaged in it from this rich description, ethnographic perspective. And he did that because he wanted people to get a sense of what it felt like to be there. And it was a very interpretive approach, very small sort of thing that he did. He looked at one particular sub-element of a culture that isn't true across the board, but is still interesting in the way that it talks about the overall understanding of Balinese cockfighting. Well, from Geertz's work with Balinese cockfighting, we have extended out his theoretical understandings of culture to make sense of a lot of other contexts. So here we get to cultural approaches to organizations, which is an interpretive theory coming out of the sociocultural tradition. It argues that organizations are components, or have components that are similar to, if not exactly like, cultures. That organizational culture is comprised of language and stories and rituals which provide webs of significance or shared meanings for members. And that if we examine things like language, stories, and rituals, we can make sense of them just like we do, organizations that is, just like we do other sorts of cultural environments. So one of the things to keep in mind here is if you've ever traveled internationally or even nationally, sometimes in the United States, you can have these moments where you experience a different type of cultural environment. And in that experience, you see that there's different, obviously, types of language in a culture, but there are stories and rituals that are very different in terms of what the cultural expectations are. I've traveled internationally a few times, and one of the more striking travel, moments in travel that I've had was traveling to Japan, where I learned all kinds of rituals that were around. It was a business trip, so around business meals and how where to keep my hands, how to sit, how to talk, how to bow. All kinds of things that were rituals that are a part of the behaviors that are commonly understood in Japanese culture. Now, if we take that and think about it from an organizational standpoint, how do businesses or other organizations have their own rituals and language and stories that are a part of the organizational culture? So when we think about what makes up a culture and what comes to mind when we think of the word culture, we do think of the types of, we think of language oftentimes. We do think of the rituals and ceremonies, holidays, food, those sorts of things that are a part of culture and how we make sense of it. Simultaneously, we can apply that in other particular ways. And when we think about organizational culture, you can think about particular business practices and the ways in which they talk about their own culture. Now, this is a moment where I invite you to think about your own organizational, cultural, lives. If you work in a particular business, or if you are have worked for a long time in a particular climate or a particular retail setting, I'm curious, what are the ways in which you can think about the organization's culture? I've worked for ASU for many years now, but before I was an academic, I worked for a lot of other places, like retail places. I worked for Starbucks for many years, and there was a very particular organizational culture to Starbucks that was innovative and supposed to be like hip and trying to find new ways of engaging with customers and very aesthetically pleasing and that kind of thing. Not some giant corporate conglomerate that was taking over the coffee scene, but like, hey, we're just like cool people that are hanging out and come have some coffee and we'll talk and have a pastry and that kind of thing. And so there's a whole organizational culture to it that was a part of what it meant to work at Starbucks. And I'm certain that many of you have a similar experience as well. Well, one of the things that is argued is that culture is a performative thing, that it's performed through things like the metaphors that are chosen within a culture, or the stories, the corporate stories about the upbringing of where did this business come from, or the personal stories that we have about our interactions with the company, or the collegial stories that coworkers share about the company or about what it means to work there. These are all a part of the performance of culture, and this is the ethnographic part of it is a means by which we can make sense of it. You've spent time in the organizations that you've worked at. You've spent time in the businesses, and you probably have your own stories and sense-making of all of it. And ethnography is one of the ways by which we can understand culture. So ethnography allows us to understand the creation, the maintenance, and the challenging of culture that's inside of it. For example, when I worked at Starbucks, there were all kinds of stories that we'd hear about Howard Schultz as the CEO and how he came to have Starbucks as a part of his existence and how he thinks about the culture. And so there's corporate stories about that. But there were personal stories about the people who worked at Starbucks, my coworkers and things, that would talk about their own experiences working with customers and how frustrating it was at times to be in that type of fast-paced retail environment. And there's collegial stories about how sometimes the company helps or hinders the individuals and how it's a supportive environment. So for example, Starbucks for a long time was offering benefits for even the part-time workers, which was a part of its commitment, which was both a corporate story in terms of their commitment and why they did that, but I'd also have collegial stories where people would tell stories about how that was good for them and their families. So the question then is, how is culture a performance, and what's the best way to learn about it? Well, organizational culture is a way of understanding that a researcher can look at the stories, the metaphors, and the rituals that are inside of organizational life. And so there might be particular things that you do in your organization that are a part of it. If you have Monday morning meetings, I know my wife for a while worked at Barnes & Noble, and every Monday they had a Monday morning meeting where the boss would, the manager of the store would come in and talk about, what are the numbers at, how are sales doing, what are other issues that are coming up, what promotions are coming up. And that was a part of the structure of and ritual of that particular organizational culture. I know that when I worked at Target, when I was in high school, there was a culture to Target, and some of the language of Target is something that was interesting. That the customers weren't called customers; they were called guests, and and that language of guests in the store was something that was pervasive in the culture. So everything surrounded this terminology of guests. Other sorts of studies that have been out there that look at organizational culture. One that's really famous that looks at Disney and the metaphors that Disney uses for its employees. One of them has to do with family. That back in the 80s, the Disney, like if you went to Disneyland in the 80s, they would talk about the internal corporate culture would talk about Disneyland employees as being family members. Part of the problem was that during one of the recessions in the 1980s, Disney had to lay off a bunch of employees. Well, how does that metaphor work when you lay off some of your family members? And so this is a way of understanding corporate culture and organizational culture as a cultural construction, and not just about like business life, but as organizational culture. And this can be a helpful way of understanding how organizations function and how they, get along, or what sort of metaphors are working and what aren't. One of the ways that we can try to understand organizational culture is through the method of ethnography. Now, I'm going to spend some time talking about ethnography, even though this isn't a methods class. And the reason why I do that is because I think it's helpful to think about ethnography as a method, because it helps us to understand how culture can be performed. So ethnography, and again, you'll learn a lot more about this if you take something like 308 or other sorts of classes, but ethnography stands for the writing of people. That's the ethno and graphy. Graphy meaning writing and ethno meaning people. The idea of ethnography as a method is to try to grasp the native's point of view. And so ethnographers spend a lot of time within a particular culture or organization or subgroup or whatever it is to try to understand the insider's view of that space and of that culture. And so what ethnographers do is they spend time doing the things that the people in this culture would do. And as they do those things, they learn about the language, the rituals, the metaphors, and the stories that are all a part of that culture. So Lidloff and Taylor, who have a very well-used and well-known methods book, talk about it as being making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And so ethnographers will ask people who are familiar with the culture to talk about the culture in ways that make it strange. We don't think of Monday morning meetings at Barnes & Noble as a ritual, but it really is. And if we can make it strange to where we think about it as a ritual, then we can tease out some of the other elements of that communication practice. Then on the other side, when we make the strange familiar, is that we may take the practices of an organization or a particular culture, which may be strange to many of us, and put them in familiar terms that we can help to make sense of it. Again, if we take a Monday morning meeting, which you may not do in your workspace, and think of it as a ritual, which is a language we can all think about, something that we do habitually, we repetitively, every week we do this thing, then it helps us to make sense of it. So it's taking a strange practice and trying to make it familiar. Well, you might be familiar with some ethnographies that are already out there in terms of film and television. And so Jane Goodall's very famous ethnographies, even though they're not people, they're more anthropological, but working with apes and chimpanzees. There are lots of documentarians that do this. This is a screenshot from Morgan Spurlock's. He had a show called 30 Days where he challenged people to do something or to live with a particular culture for 30 days. And you may have seen this. This is from like 10 years ago. But this is a show that was trying to highlight some of the practices of individual subcultures. And he'd oftentimes do that with some critical challenging in mind. And so he had a devout Christian live with a devout Muslim family to see how that would go. He actually did an episode at ASU where it didn't go very well, but the idea was he wanted to have a mother of a college student drink like a college student for 30 days to see what that was like and try to party like a college student for 30 days. It was just mainly an episode full of hangovers because when you're in your 40s and 50s, you can't hang anymore. And so other things, Mike Rowe had his show Dirty Jobs that was on for a long time, and that's where he would go to specific jobs, people that worked in jobs that were not fun, the jobs that were, that we don't think of them as fun, but they're very dirty, I remember some episodes where he'd worked with trash collectors, and he worked with, and one of them was about mushroom farming. And so, he would go and spend time and ask them questions like, how do you do this? What is this like? What is it like to work in this particular industry? And then, of course, there's all sorts of fictional films out there that do ethnographic type work where someone has to learn about a particular culture. And so the famous one of Avatar had the giant blue people, and the Marine, whatever his name was, had to learn about the blue people to be a part of them. And so you can watch the film as he learns the cultural practices. I think they're called like the Na'vi or something like that. And so these are familiar ethnographies, but we can also do ethnographies from a more research perspective. And so I'm going to share just a little bit of my research where I worked with an organization called DanceSafe. And this is back in my dissertation work many years ago, where I joined an organization called DanceSafe that goes to a particular subcultural environment of raves. And these are the all-night dance parties where ecstasy is consumed, other drugs as well. And youth congregate to listen to music and to dance and to do the things that you do. And so this is a space that has a very specific subcultural sort of musical understanding that's very fanciful, very juvenile and purposeful and celebratory of that. And I went there to join with DanceSafe because I was curious about the culture, but I was also curious about this specific organization and the ways that they were trying to get a health message across to the many youth there. So in the context of raves, this is a space where lots of people will be dancing, but a lot of people are ingesting drugs. And DanceSafe was there to try to provide health information for those so they can make better choices about their drug use. It's their perspective is not an abstinence-only perspective. It's not to say that drugs are bad, don't do them. It's to say that, hey, if people are going to use drugs, they should know what they're doing, and maybe we can reduce the harms that are associated with drugs. And so it's called harm reduction. So I joined DanceSafe many years ago, and when I was working with them, I was studying their particular types of message strategies. I was ultimately looking to see how they were persuasive or not for this particular culture, but I was also invested into the organizational culture of DanceSafe itself. What are the ways that they try to fit into raver culture? How do they engage that? And so here on the DanceSafe table, you can see this is where all the pamphlets and information are there. But they gave out free candy and free fruit, knowing that people sometimes don't eat when they go to raves because they want the drugs to kick in faster, or that candy is a part of the overall subculture of raving, and that fits in. Of course, I did study the health information that was there. That was a mainstay of the dissertation practice, but still, there's lots of other things. There's a picture of me, again, a much younger version of me, talking with the individuals that are there to try to make sense of the organizational culture of DanceSafe, but also how it engages in this particular health campaign. And as we interacted with ravers, we were trying to figure out how they made their health choices and why they chose the particular things they did. So if I recall correctly, this particular individual was wanting to talk about the interaction between antidepressants and ecstasy. Here's me at another rave, and again, looking at some of the health information that was presented and talking about what DanceSafe was all about. And so part of my dissertation was certainly looking at organizational culture and as it's put together, and most of the other part of my dissertation was looking at some of the rhetorical elements of what DanceSafe was doing. But I spent time with DanceSafe for 2 years with DanceSafe, going to everything that they went to, going to recruitment and recruiting other individuals and doing planning for the raves that we went to, all to make sense of what the organization was doing inside of this larger subculture. But that ethnographic experience is to say that I spent a long time learning the language and rituals and habits of DanceSafe members. So when it comes to organizational culture, ethnography can assist in making sense of it, that we can go into a space and use ethnography as a method. But hopefully you can see that you can get a sense of the types of metaphors or language and rituals and ceremonies that are a part of the culture and try to get to those webs of significance. How do people make meaning out of the different practices? You can analyze the ways that stories are traded, or that the rituals are performed, or that the metaphors are maintained. In DanceSafe, there were all kinds of metaphors. The whole rave scene has peace, love, unity, and respect. Plur is this, this statement, this part of language inside of rave culture. And DanceSafe wanted to add an extra R on the bottom of it that said peace, love, unity, respect, and responsibility. And so those are language games that are played within the subculture of DanceSafe. So one thought experiment, or maybe a theory reflection that you can do here, is to think about the organizational culture of ASU. If you don't have any work experience, if you've never worked a retail job or never done some research, and I don't imagine that many of you have, then maybe you can think about the organizational culture of being a student at ASU. What are the rituals that are performed? What language is there? What metaphors are used? How do we understand ASU and its organizational culture? My guess is that you won't talk about things like bear down, but you might think about other things that are part of the culture that are very different. And so if you go to ASU football games, what rituals are a part of that, or other sports events? Lots of ways out there of thinking through organizational culture, and again, the types of metaphors, rituals, and stories that are told. Well, that's it for the cultural approaches to organizations. If you have any questions about that, feel free to offer those up on Canvas. But for now, think through that last question about theory reflections and, try to make sense of the cultural understanding of organizations, because it's a powerful way of thinking through our organizational life.